Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second day. So today I would like to introduce you all to our panel speakers. We have Dr. Renske Marie Van Dam. Dr. Renske is an artist, architect, and academic based in The Hague, in Netherlands. Her work focuses on shaping social and ecological transformation through spatial practice. She collaborates across disciplines and with communities to develop equitable participatory approaches to space making. Our second speaker is Dr. Zehra Aziz. She's a principal architect at Particles. Zehra Aziz is an architect and principal architect at Particles with international experience at Noor Dubai and MJA, and a background from Middle Eastern Technical University in Turkey. She's also a founding member of Art of Small Talk and part of the Tea Collaborative, engaging communities through interdisciplinary participatory art practices. Our third speaker, Aisha Ali, works in placemaking and stakeholder engagements, and she's a consultant at Arcadis Global. She has over 20 years of experience delivering complex development projects across the public and private sectors, and is recognized among the 50 most influential women in planning. She leads people-centric collaborative approaches to strategy and co-design, as well as implementation. Our fourth speaker for today, architect Sana Numan, is the president of Women in Architecture Pakistan. Sana is an architect. She's well accredited and a zero waste professional, and the founder of Women in Architecture Pakistan and a co-founder of Breathe.io. Her work focuses on sustainability, urban metabolism, and women's everyday experiences, bridging research and practice towards more equitable cities. I would like you to join me in welcoming our speakers today. Ladies, thank you all for taking the time out from your extremely busy schedules and on a Saturday, nonetheless, when our schedules kind of put everything to the side, we could take a breath. And I think it's a great time for us to get together and just have a general talk on where we're wanting to head from now on with respect to the ideas of spatial practices and how we are social drivers within spatial practice. So my first question, what we're going to do is we're going to conduct this session a little thematically. We'll go from, because what we've been doing, as you know, is been discussing and engaging with the students on mapping exercises. That was the task of yesterday as well as today. And the concern for any architect really who has studied architecture is when you go through a very theoretical and research-driven exercise, how do you translate that into material practice? Where does the meaningful impact actually come in? And how does this bring about material change? So my first question, and we can start with Dr. Renske, if you're okay with that. Yeah. How can mapping move beyond representation to become a tool for revealing hidden inequalities, particularly those related to gender, ecology, and everyday life?
It's a big question. That's well, when I was listening yesterday to the presentation about the previous studio and about the approach of mapping and the different layers that show up in a mapping, uh, I was thinking about a mapping exercise that I used to do a couple of years ago with students. Actually, these were students of art practice. So we were looking at space, but not from a like completely trained architectural view. And my premise was to start from the body and from the sensorial experience. So we had a huge shipyard in Amsterdam as our planning site, and we started to explore this literally with our bodies. Just people were um, just following their interest. A lot of people were just sitting on the shipyard. There's a lot of resonance and a lot of vibration going on, of course, in this industrial area. So they were either blindfolded or for maybe half an hour just holding a part of the ropes or of the ships there as a starting point to relate to the spaces around them in a different way. And this was the starting point for a mapping exercise where these students were not used to mapping, but I still invited them to make a map. And I called this an intensive map, rather than extensive, what we are as architects are used, like this is a tree, here's a house, but more to, what are the colors or the sensations that come up. And this resulted in extremely beautiful, almost painting-like mapping of and it for me it was such a eye-opening experience to start from there instead of defining everything, start from this more sensorial experience. And listening yesterday to all the perspectives, I'm always thinking like feminism is also very much about an embodied experience because it's about the bodily differences. That's where we start with. Um, But I started to think, and I have no answer yet. This was just an idea coming up yesterday. Um, that maybe we can even go a few steps further there, and really start to, as architects also, this sensorial practice is one of the layers of our craftsmanship. Um, and I started to be very curious how from a female or intersectional feminist perspective, we could include this in sensorial perspective even more. Yeah, and how we then end up. Well, I actually think that somehow that there could lie a starting point for including also the wider perspective of marginalized perspectives, but still stay with the artistic and the crafts of making spaces. That's it for now.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. I'll take the question over to Zara. If you could let us know what you think, like how do we move mapping beyond the physical representation of a space, and how do we use it to identify spatial inequalities, and how do then, in your perspective, either relate to gender or urban ecology or social ecology and just everyday life?
Okay. Let me give a little bit of background as to the sort of work that I do. I facilitate, I run a space which facilitates different architects, artists, creative
Zara, I'm sorry for
practitioners to come.
Zara, I'm sorry for interrupting. I think there's a bit of a signal issue on your end. Sorry, there was a bit of a signal issue on your end. We missed that.
Is it okay now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and again it started.
I'm sorry, we're in a lockdown today, and the internet is also. Just a second.
Yes.
She can stop her video.
Yeah, Zara, perhaps if you stop your video and just go to audio, that might help with the bandwidth.
Is it better now?
Yeah, but okay. So let's try this again.
I'm sorry. We're as you know, we're in a lockdown, and the internet has also been acting a bit funny since morning. So the lag could be because of that. So just let me know when you can't hear me. So in the previous few instances, I worked with some architects and designers, and we have been doing mapping exercises with the local communities in Islamabad who come to the studio. And as you know, Islamabad has a very top-down approach to mapping because it's a lot of like rigid regulations, zoning, property value, economy, politics. So it's always seen from the top, but lived experiences are not really accounted for. And all of these exercises have been about putting those lived experiences on the map. So a bridge or an underpass is not necessarily conducive to pedestrians or for women to feel safe crossing the street. So I think for me, this tool, it is a very effective tool of representation, but it needs both these layers where you have the formal lines that we draw as architects or city planners, and then you also share or put another layer as to how people are experiencing that area. And you need to call those people in to participate and co-create. And so I feel that is a missing layer. I don't know. I think you have a lot more questions after this, and we probably have a lot of different perspectives. But this is how I think mapping works in my head at the moment.
Thank you so much. So connecting with that theme and taking it a bit forward now, Sana, my question to you is, since you teach, you're studying as well, you practice as well, so you've got like a multi-layered dimensional understanding really of the mapping process right now, I think more so than most of us. So how do you feel that, can you shed some insight on how can you reflect on strategies then that could ensure that the mapping process does not remain entirely extractive, but can lead to accountability and some sort of long-term change?
Is that a question to me?
No, to Sana.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Nava. I think commenting on the first question as well, because I think mapping we can move beyond like mapping just being representative to having an impact when it turns into a tool where we uncover power struggles, because from the moment where you decide to map something, so whose knowledge is brought into account to decide what to map, and then moving down the line to what is mapped, and then when mapped, how is it presented or interpreted. So that is one layer of the power struggle where our own biases do come in as people who prepare maps as well. So I think we as architects, or we as planners, or we as in whatever capacity, if we're uh, conducting this exercise or doing it ourselves, so we need to keep our biases in check as well. Secondly, I think moving beyond extractive mapping, like Zehra also mentioned, that the people that are being mapped, or the communities or the places, they need to be brought in the conversation. And I personally believe that, like you mentioned, that having experience of studying at the moment and teaching and practice, we need a mixed method sort of an approach, where I think this one single layer of mapping, either from each end, is not enough. Maybe we do need to delve in a little more with participant observations or storytelling, or experiencing that community ourselves. So it is only then that we can mapping does not remain neutral, the impact actually comes in it.
Thank you so much for your insight on this, Sana. Aisha, thank you for joining us. Apologies again for the misunderstanding, but we're so glad you were able to make it. So Aisha, my question to you then, continuing with this, the first question we asked was, how can mapping become something that is beyond a tool for, beyond representation, and become a tool for, identifying hidden inequalities? And then you have worked in practice on an urban sphere. You have brought about material changes and interventions within the city. So then, from your experience and knowledge as well, formal, informal, embodied, how can conventional mapping practices then be meaningfully integrated?
Thank you so much, and it's great to be here. I'm so glad I came. I think it's a very complex subject and an area, mapping. As you know, I'm based in the UK, but I do see a lot of similarities in the way practice is undertaken here and abroad in places such as Pakistan. I think obviously some of the dynamics are different and the processes, but in essence, I think as communities and as people, we all want the same thing across the globe, which is clean, safe spaces, accessible spaces that are equal to everyone and inclusive. So there are a lot of similarities and overlaps, I feel. In terms of mapping, so I've had quite a bit of a journey with mapping and stakeholder engagement over the past 20 years. And the process was always seen as an add-on at the end of the project. So it was never part of the initial project brief where the importance was given to aspects such as mapping and, engagement. So I think it really does depend on who's commissioning the project as well. And sometimes when the emphasis is placed on undertaking mapping as a key part of the project, I feel those projects long term are way more sustainable and successful. But when mapping is seen as almost like an add-on because it sounds good and we better do this because we have accountability, then often it's just a tick box process. So from my perspective, in terms of mapping, it is who's commissioned the project and how much budget has been set aside for that mapping to take place. Picking up on Sana's point and Zara's point combinedly about the time spent doing mapping and who's actually doing that. Again, I think it needs to be done from a very independent perspective. So often in the UK, we work with clients and local authorities that say, oh, we've done the mapping and this is the list that we need you to use to engage with certain communities and map. However, again, it's to delve in deeper and to really work closely and co-design with local people and give them that empowerment. It's another deeper layer that requires both time, resources, and has to be factored into the project timeline. Otherwise, it kind of goes all a bit pear-shaped. So as you can see, it's quite a complex subject for me. Again, in my practice, I often kind of advocate co-design with communities. And I've worked on several projects where when we've done that from the outset and part of the brief, it's, oh my God, it's paid off. Those projects have been long-term sustainable spaces developed, which the communities actually feel like it's an extension of their homes rather than a civic space. So yeah, that's my perspective.
Thank you so much, Aisha. Zara, my next question is to you, and kind of taking off from what Aisha was speaking about and bringing us back to what you were speaking about with respect to you having worked in architectural practices where mapping is a part of the process, and where Aisha says that, is it just a box that you tick, oh, look, I've done this. So what do you think it takes to translate insights from the mapping process into tangible design policy or, planning interventions? How do we move beyond it just being a box that has to be ticked? Sorry, you're on mute. You have to unmute. Yeah.
So, obviously, institutions have to be in part of, or you have to take that process that you've done to an institution that has the power to translate that research or the findings of that research into physical form. I'm thinking out loud, like a lot of times that mapping exercise, because I've always been a bystander and a facilitator to others to carry out that exercise. And when people come into the space, number one, who are those people who are coming into the space to take part in that exercise? For example, let's even narrow it down to just specifically talking about women and how women feel in a certain area, a certain sector. We walked in a certain sector in Islamabad, which was the G9 Markaz, and it's one of the oldest areas and designed on a very rigid structure in relation to the bureaucracy of Islamabad, with categorization of different people in different blocks in that sector. And further narrowing it down, we went into a courtyard, and it's marked as a playground in the map. But when we went there, we spoke to a few women who were gathered around the washing line. And they were just waiting there since like 2 or 3 hours for their clothes to dry. So in a way, that space not only became a playground, but also where they come and they sit and they talk to each other and they share what they're cooking or what they're feeling. So that data is valuable. I think institutions need to understand that that data needs to be recorded. And whether you're redesigning or, you're not redesigning and you're just recording things as they are, those lived experiences have to be part of that data where someone else can probably use it as a reference. And whatever that institute may be, maybe they don't have to do something very large scale. They can do something very small, like a pilot project that reinvents that space based on taking those voices and co-designing with those voices. Whatever little intervention that you need to make, maybe it's just a swing or a slide in that play area, or maybe it's some plantation, or maybe it's a bench that is more conducive to those women sitting together comfortably. So yeah, just speaking from these recent activities and experiences that I've had. And what those institutions are, whether they're interested in this or not, I don't know, but I believe others might be able to answer that better.
So, Rensker, then the question comes back to you. Then taking off from Azera said, so categorically, the need for institutional integration for any venture of this scale to making the ideas that one comes across from mapping exercises to lived realities. So how could you perhaps identify for us exactly which institutions should be considered or must be a part of this, framework? And then how can we then perhaps convince them to work with, what the map is actually telling them, that this is the ground reality of that space?
It's an interesting question, and I'm also tying together now like the previous comments, because I really think it's a valuable comment to point out that the mapping process should be part of the commission. And then you start thinking about, when I was studying architecture, we were taught to map more to, get a feeling for the space you're working with. So there's a design question and you get some understanding of the sizes of the site. And this is very much a mapping exercise you do for yourself as a designer to understand. But if you talk about systemic change, and that's what we are all interested in, mapping becomes way more an awareness tool. It becomes a tool to create awareness for yourself, but also for the community and the institutions and the clients and everything you work with. And if you talk about systemic change, there's also the complexity of the lived experiences and the ecologies that are relevant to there are way more important to map them all out and to include them all, which definitely includes all the communities. And then there's the question, who then is giving this commission? Who is seeing the interest for this? And I think, to be honest, I think even in Europe, I really think about the EU now as like somebody who could give this commission. In the EU, there is interest for change. Also interest for systemic change, not necessarily yet for a complete. I think there could be way more done for like broadening the understanding of what systemic change actually is and what that includes. But there is more and more awareness that the things we work right now don't work anymore. So it's also like we could start working with that early interest in systemic change, with this like shared growing of uneasiness. And this is, yeah, I'm thinking about this a lot. And this is also, of course, we don't have like, you cannot always be picky about the clients, but you can at least make them aware that maybe the mapping as a practice could be is needed to be done, because I don't think, I mean, it is very easy to say, this is important for the communities we work with, so they should be responsible for giving us that assignment. But I don't think it's that easy, and it's not going to work like that. So yeah, maybe I would way more look at uh, the municipalities, the provinces, the more national or international planning agencies. And yeah, I'm very positive in that there is a seat there, but that's the European perspective, I would say.
Fair enough. So Sana, since you are working towards, with the clean, green energy and sustainable environments, and with your organization, where do you think the systemic change, like who are the partner agencies or the institutions that we need to actually integrate on this, on a larger forum? For example, within Pakistan, how do you propose mapping as an exercise can be evolved to focus on this particular aspect of design and planning? And who are the agencies or institutions that we should be plugging into the larger conversation?
I think from your question, what I've understood is we're coming around governance now, and how governance plays an integral role in uh, sustainability, and the way our cities function and how sustainable or unsustainable they are. I think it would actually depend on the scale of the intervention, the project that is. If you could like just narrow down the scale, maybe I didn't understand. Like, is it like a general question you're asking that uh, on a
So,
larger?
so where Rensker spoke about, for example, she gave this understanding of the EU, right? Okay, on a European perspective, perhaps these are the institutions and the agencies because they have the funding, some of they have the will, they have the desire. Where do we see, for example, from within Pakistan, can we identify any institution which does have that kind of will and desire? And then how can we expand the conversation with them from from a mapping perspective to make these material changes within the built environment?
I think we'd have to cater to all the levels, starting from the top to bottom or bottom to up, from the macro to the meso to the micro level. One thing I just pitch in, one thing I've experienced in my current research is when I'm looking at the impact of water supply on the everyday lived experiences of women in a low income neighborhood in Pakistan, is the disparity between the policy and the lived experience. So I think there, that is where mapping comes in. That is where you highlight the lived realities of these people. And then like currently I'm looking at these water schedules, and then how these women's lives are rotate around those water schedules, which leads to temporal poverty. So you have you have economic power, you have spatial poverty, and then there's temporal poverty, where your time dependent on a particular infrastructure. So I think mapping does play a key role, where you can take these conversations to a higher level, and then you cannot just only engage at the national level. I think the regional and the national, starting from the community groups as well, because the way things are in Pakistan, we have these local informal bodies as well, where these communities have their own selected leaders, and then they communicate with at a city scale, and then those communicate at a regional scale, and then the national scale. So all these scales need to be engaged. I hope
Okay,
I
that's a great.
answered the question to a certain extent.
Oh, no, you did. And I think you also identified a very interesting dynamic as well. I feel, I mean, this is just me giving an observation right now, just based on what you were thinking, what you were talking about. Perhaps mapping as a tool is also something that the importance of mapping as a tool becomes more important, I would say, in the current time that we're living in, considering I would say that if we're to for example, educate the future generations. We're seeing this material shift right now, and how information is being provided to, and the capacity to retain information as well. And we are moving towards a very visual society, I feel. Attention and retention of information, perhaps mapping can start taking a more material shift by really becoming a more powerful tool for actually disseminating information on a larger capacity, where we are not so focused on the written word, because the written word people don't want to read anymore. You see, this is something I'm pretty sure all of us across the board are feeling this. I mean, I feel this as a teacher as well. So we could perhaps talk about, like how the visualization of the mapping becomes a powerful tool in itself, and then that could also impact or perhaps imprint in the need for policy change through that visualization. Aisha, my question to you then comes, because again, we've seen, you've discussed your practice with us last year when you had come for the workshop. You had spoken to us about, how you had brought about, you'd shared your projects with us. We've seen the case studies. So within this, how do institutional, political or economic constraints shape the kinds of actions that are possible after mapping, like the day after the mapping is done? How do these dynamics influence practitioners, and how can then practitioners push back against these limitations that are sometimes brought about?
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually. I think my view is quite simplistic on the whole issue around mapping and how we make this something that's considered heavily in the design process. I think it is about policy, and often we can't make things happen until it's in policy and it's something that's almost mandatory or at least statutory. So at the moment with mapping, I think it sits very nicely within the stakeholder engagement strategy within projects, because it's a key part of a stakeholder engagement strategy. So, for example, in the UK, there is policy around stakeholder engagement, which involves a lot of work around mapping, but it's still very, I would say, not very conclusive and can be quite vague at times. So when planning applications are considered here in the UK, and I'm sure it's a similar process in Pakistan, there is now a focus on, so how much stakeholder engagement have you done, and what is your mapping process, and other aspects of the engagement. And that's how it's actually almost made developers change their views, knowing that from a planning perspective, they won't get approval for their schemes unless they've actually carried out that significant piece of work with communities and with local stakeholders. So I know that sounds quite harsh, but I think sometimes the only way you can get people to do things in a way from the perspectives of equality, diversity, and inclusion is when it's built into the policy. So I think that's key. Secondly, I think there has to be a tangible output in terms of tangible in the sense of it's an impact that's you can see physically. So if there's a demonstration that a piece of work that you do has a good thorough mapping exercise and engagement with communities, which leads to a better design proposal, hence financially long-term sustainability for that project, I think you're more likely to get buy-in. So looking at case studies around the world where that process has taken place, I think that really does almost like makes developers and people who are not being commissioned by the government outside of that role look at this process as, oh, it will add value and long-term benefits to our scheme. So I think there's a couple of things there. But I think essentially, it's best practice, it's good practice to do good stakeholder engagement. But then what's the influence of that best practice? If it's not statutory or mandatory within the policy framework, just how much can you convince people, us as practitioners, know the value of this, right? And I've heard from the other speakers as well, how even things like creating a safe space for women where there's a bench can have a massive impact on how that space is used. So we know the benefits, but then how do we turn those benefits into something that's seen A, as tangible, and B, as favoured in the planning process where approval takes place on the basis of the developer or the designer taking that into account? So I think my view is quite simplistic on this, on how we can make change. There's appetite for change, but how do we push that agenda onto a wider scale?
It actually sounds like we need to also include mapping after the project to also map the change that happened, to make the value more visible. That's
Yeah, and often we don't
So
do
yeah.
that, do we? We don't follow up and see the effects a project has had and what's worked and what's not, and how we can use that for future proposals.
So I think actually that's a very good point, because the documentation, we use the mapping process to convince or to sell the idea, but then once, if it has been successfully implemented, and let's say after a number of years we see that success actually play out in real time, we don't go back to redocument that space to kind of project how it was successful and see, this is why we convinced you, and this is how it's, maybe this is something one needs to, this is a good way. We don't follow up. I feel as designers and as architects and even practitioners, I guess to a certain extent, one does not really follow up with how the time and investment that you went about for pushing for that material change, how has that actually brought about material change. We may discuss it in case studies or in our talks when we showcase our projects, but perhaps it's very limited as an actual documented discourse. And so my question, Sana, then is, and coming back to, if you could just link it back to, the research that you're doing on the idea of women and water, and the timing, because now we get back into that loop of the how the gendered idea of these spatial practices that are going on. So then, how can practitioners sustain inclusive and participatory processes beyond the initial engagement phases? Like, how can we ensure communities then remain the central focus at all times for that space that has been negotiated for them?
I think it's multi-tiered. First of all, when we talk about community engagement or stakeholder engagement, how long is that engagement? When there's a trend, I don't know about Aisha's experience in the UK, but here in our local context, I've seen that people are engaged for a very short period of time, and that has developed a sense of that has left a bad taste, because people are not informed about the consequences of the research that was done or the mapping that was done. How will their community be impacted by that? And they are not kept part of the conversation once that mapping exercise is done. So it's like, it's done, we've sent it, again a very top down approach, and then they're just told to live with it. So that is one thing which is very important, that we need to keep in mind, that how long do we keep them engaged. Secondly, one thing that I've experienced here is the ethical considerations. Yes, mapping is very important, but how does that have any ethical implications for the people who are being mapped or the communities that are being mapped? And are the people responsible for mapping aware of these critical complex challenges? Because sometimes we do come into communities with an external vision, with our own vision or a vision from another institution, and then we come into those communities with that vision without keeping in mind the vulnerabilities of those communities. So then later on, the impact is quite different than what we had already perceived or imagined. So then there's the perceived realities, and then coming back to the lived realities. So it is multi-layered, multi-tiered, where we have ethical considerations, we have longer term community engagement with the people that we're working with. Only then, and then, like Dr. Renske explained, that mapping before and after. There are a lot of organizations now that do go in and do impact studies on the projects that they have done before, like after a few months or after a few years, they go into those communities and they do impact studies, that either the solutions that were perceived through those mapping or other exercises, are they actually happening in that manner?
So, so now, Zara, my question to you, kind of bringing all of this together. So we know we've talked about the lived, conceived, and perceived. We're talking about the trialectics of space and the production of space, and we understand that. Sorry, I'm so sorry. We understand that by and large, particularly in the global South countries, and generally development is seen in a very hyper-capitalistic perspective. Who does this benefit? What are the cost benefits essentially at the end of the day of this project? And I believe Aisha also kind of spoke about that one can only convince if there's some material benefit that comes about, particularly for the policymakers and the guys who are in charge of everything. But then it's trying to rationalize the top down with the bottom up, because that's what Sana also spoke about, that we need to have this kind of middle tier approach towards mapping and understanding. So how do you think that one can navigate the tension that is created between data-driven mapping and then the lived experience, especially when there are conflicting ideas about narratives of what those spaces are actually about, because we come from a top-down perspective and we have to come from a bottom-up perspective. So somebody practicing in the field, how do we bring about that rationalization?
So I think the question for me would be what is missing and for whom it is missing. And that conflict can exist. Like this, we don't have to whitewash it. So embrace that conflict and try and find solutions around it. And mapping in our context can be used for advocacy. It can be a movement. And like Sana also said, that everything here is decided from the top, and it trickles down to the bottom. But if there was a group of people who decide what their lived experience should be in their area, they could definitely be advocates to pressurize institutions to bring about those solutions. But as an arts organization, at Art of Small Talk, I feel like we act as mediaries, where we facilitate those groups to come into our space and have a voice, and they can come a number of times. I feel like those mediary organizations or systems don't exist. For example, a planner who has to sit on a drawing board and draw a map, and he wants to go and talk to the people of that area. How can he just, as an individual, they may not take him seriously, or he may not have access, or those community or groups of people may not trust him or her or that institution. So those middle institutions or collectives or informal advocacy groups need to exist to let those voices from one end to the other. So sorry, I forgot what the question was, but I just kept on ranting. But
No, it's fine. So it's okay. I think you kind of addressed the gist of it, which is basically that we kind of need to bring everybody on the same page, and we need not fight the conflict. We can embrace the conflict and actually keep it as a part of this normative conversation, because at the end of the day, no spaces in any part of the world are perfect. There's always this layer of chaos, and there's nothing wrong with chaos. Chaos actually makes the city and that urban space what it is. It gives it that identity. So perhaps the question should be, or perhaps this is something that we can discuss maybe later, how to embrace the chaos. And does the chaos become a part of the mapping process? And then how does mapping actually celebrate the chaos? You know what I mean? But for now, I think we have time for one more question, which I'm going to ask to all of you before we move to open the floor for any comments or remarks or questions from the audience. And this has more now to do on an academic perspective, because we talk about mapping and we talk about urban practices and design practices in the urban sphere. And we've got an audience of students over here right now who are focused on this, who've conducted this exercise. So Renske, I would like to start with you first, Renske. looking ahead, what shifts are necessary within the academic pedagogical perspective that are necessary to move from isolated interventions, because we still tend to teach isolationism in a lot of ways in our design studios, to more towards more systemic and justice oriented spatial transformations? Like, what do you feel students should be more cognizant of with the mapping process, and how to bring that about into design interventions?
Well, when I was listening to everybody, I was thinking that even though we talk about systemic change, and this is especially happening in Europe, but I think this is also more in global architectural discourse it comes across. If we talk about systemic change, we still do this in a sense of in the sense of acceleration. So systemic change should be, it's still like something that needs to be solved quickly, and also, if possible, leads to a good life for all. There's this premise of like design and architecture can, and then there's good life for all. And I very much like your comment about chaos there, and about I feel like we need to find this middle way between the speculative future and the lived experience that is there. And I feel that in the way we frame the exercises for the students and in the way we talk about it, we still have this, I don't know, also because we are trained like this, we're still okay, we see the bigger picture now, and there's need for slowing down, there's need for way layered mapping, but then still we end up we go from speculative future to like the perfect end result. And I'm really looking for ways where we can open this middle ground, where it's okay that we collectively question, uh, and we collectively try to figure out. It's open-ended, it's unfinished, it's chaotic, and that we kind of stay there. And I'm really trying to create this open space in the academic institution and when I'm teaching and in my own practice always. But it's very, you need to be aware of that, because there's always like, okay, what do the students learn in this course? What are the goals? What are, what is, so there's always this tendency to frame it towards the good life for all in the end. Yeah, so I don't know the questions or the answers there, but I think it is good that in an like with students, with the whole management board of the universities, and as teachers, we all together dare to ask these questions towards the chaotic or the open-ended there. That would give a completely different way of teaching and working together, I think. Yeah, so I'm always trying to advocate for that. But yeah.
I think actually that sounds like a very exciting way to like perhaps start or hold a studio. Let's embrace the chaos. Aisha, what do you think? Like with from practice to teaching, you've seen students work. How can we bring about material change with how we teach students to look at these perspectives and that shift? How do we bring it towards a more justice oriented and systemic change, spatial transformation?
Yeah, I really liked one of the comments that Sarah made. I think collaboration is key. And I think for students to know that too, that a role of an architect or planner is very much a conduit between them and the rest of the world. And I think that's the way it needs to be framed to students, that you are in a very unique position where you are working in different spheres and with different stakeholders. So it can be political, it can be with other designers, it can be with kind of groups such as Zara represents, art groups, really important grassroots organizations. So I think that mindset has to shift within our students, and we have to tell them that you're not just going to be sitting in a dark room designing on your own. Your job will involve you working with a whole range of diverse stakeholders within a city or a town or wherever you're based. When I was teaching at Cardiff University, I've taught both times on the master's degree, and it was quite surprising that the undergraduate students had never come across stakeholder engagement in their course, or they had never come across mapping previously, which was quite surprising for me because I very much felt like it's something that should be built into the course structure from day one, because the professions that we're very fortunate. They can't be done in isolation. They are about creating key partnerships, key collaboration processes. So I think for me, from an academic perspective, there needs to be more of a shift towards how we frame what in practice the work looks like, because as I say, it's never that way, is it, where you're in a dark room by yourself master planning a city. It involves numerous consultants, political backing, government processes. So I think that's the thing that's key for me, that as our roles, it is about being a conduit between yourselves and the rest of the world, and see that as an exciting thing and embrace it. And it's a very good place to be, where you're that person pulling down different dynamics, different aspects together and making things happen. So again, maybe I view things in a very simplistic way, but I think the approach of working with other agencies and organizations is key, for students to understand very early on in the course.
I think that's actually a very good point, that we need to introduce students or make them understand that one does not work in isolation as an architect or designer, that we have to have there are partner institutions that are working together and help them identify. And so Zara, when with the work that you do, again, you lived in Pakistan, you've worked in Pakistan, like, how do you think, I'm sure you've gone for juries, I guess, to like universities, and you've taken, so where do you feel the shortcomings within, for example, Pakistan are coming across, and how do you think we can bring that change about in a pedagogical approach towards teaching spatial justice and the translation of this mapping process into some sort of tangible outcome?
Okay, so I think, again, my understanding of it would be very simplistic, but I will try to answer that. And because I also practice as an architect, so I understand what our constraints are as practitioners, and my work as a representative of an arts organization, and I'm constantly trying to bridge the gap, but haven't been successful to do it. Always been working in two separate streams, and I understand why, because as practitioners, or as students of architecture in Pakistan, we have a very outcome-driven approach to architecture, rather than a process-driven approach. And it's always about what it looks like in the end, and everyone's talking about it, whether it's a crit session or a jury, because I always go at the very end of the project, and that's what we're all focusing on. And I understand why, because even practicing, we don't get enough time to work on that process. So maybe just putting it simplistically, like slowing down of things, living slowly, eating slowly, and drawing slowly and observing slowly. All of those things need to be emphasized upon when working on projects, giving students enough tools and time to have that interdisciplinary approach, to see a project from an artistic or a ecological or a gender or a political, or a institutional perspective, rather than just focusing on the physical realm or the visual realm. I feel, for me, that has more value, than what comes out at the end. So, yeah.
Thank you, Zara. That was really nice to hear. Sana, can I ask you to conclude now, again, with your like multi-layered position across the, you practice, you're teaching, you're studying, you're doing everything. Where do you think the shortcomings are, and how do you think we will bridge these shortcomings within the pedagogy that we are, how do we approach this?
Um, I'd like to build upon what Sarah was saying, that I believe in architectural education, we have a very poetic view of mapping. Like it's about visuals, it's about beautiful visuals. And I've seen that with my students as well, that it's always about they present a beautiful map and then they don't understand the complexity and they can't present a nuanced understanding of what that map actually represents. And then it does not stop there. Those maps, how are they interpreted and then translated into interventions? That is the key. Where you're not just mapping for the sake of mapping. Why are you mapping? So that is critical for them. And then the lens with which they analyze those maps. That brings me to another critical point, which we have experienced as teachers and as students as well, that we, talking in a very local context, that we have these imported Western models that we put upon, that we use as a lens to analyze very local contexts. So, we need to focus more on southern urbanism, like southern theories, and then to truly understand. It's not like that we can't really use those Western models. We can learn from them, but then not blindly follow them. To you need to locally understand your local context as well. And I feel that our students lack that. Maybe as teachers, we are not properly communicating this to them. And then moving towards practice, I think education does not exist in isolation. Education, practice, and then governance, they all bridge together, because our policymakers do at some level engaged with bodies like PCAT-P that are making decisions at a city and regional level. So it does go from top up and bottom down. These tiers are well connected. So what happens as at education does have an impact at governance to a certain extent. So like just bringing it all together, co-production, being critical of how you actually look at things is key to what I think we need to make our students learn that. So I think I'll end there, because I think I've gone on long enough.
I think that's great. And I think if I just kind of sum the closing right now with this, is we just understand that we need to contextualize the chaos and embrace it and not fight it, and create our own systems of understanding within it. And then perhaps we're able to bring about material change beyond the visual. And I thank you all for your time and for your collective input and for your insights. And I'll take this opportunity to open the floor if there are any questions or comments or, any observations that anyone has made. Our students are also a bit tired because they've been working for 4 hours in the studio. So half of them are like, no, we're good right now. But it's been an amazing conversation with you ladies. I've learned a lot, and I thank you all for, your valuable insight. Ramuna?
No, thank you so much. I just want to thank you so much, Nabha, for moderating this session so well. I am so happy that I am just sitting in the audience and listening to all you lovely ladies talking about such important things and listening to the various perspectives. Yesterday was a very interesting session, and I really enjoyed today as well. I think we're all facing the similar problems in our practices and in our teaching, and no matter it is in UK, European context, or Pakistan, but the chaos is everywhere. And I really like that possibly this is a takeaway we can have from this session, to embrace the chaos. Thank you so much, Rensker, Aisha, Zahra, and Sana, for your availability.
Sorry, there's a comment by Ishita. If you could read it out loud to the audience.
Yes, I'm opening it. Okay. Ishita, thank you all for such rich and practice-specific insights into the subject. I want you to introduce one more provocation where we don't differentiate between drawings for research and communication versus drawing for construction. Very well said. Very well said, Ishita. In that situation, are you able to visualize that mapping exercise and drawings can be reimagined as resources that help in making decisions or actual impact on the sites?
Excellent point.
It's an excellent point.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you, Ishita.
Thank you so much, everyone. We'll close this
Okay.
session now. We were in the studio. We were also concluding the maps that are generated today. We have pinned them up and we were having a discussion. We had discussions on 2 groups yet, and now we'll have on the 3rd group, and then we'll conclude today's session. I will share all the pictures and the outcome from the studio exercise today as soon as I can.
Thank you.
Of
Thanks,
course,
Mamina.
no worries. Thank
Thanks,
you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you
Bye.
all.
Bye for
Bye.
now,
Bye.
everyone. Take
Bye.
care. Bye bye.